Compendia use by Medicare and Medicaid, private payer coverage of off-label drug use, manufacturer strategies for Compendia inclusion. What impact do Compendia play in the commercial success of pharmaceutical products, and what can manufacturers do to optimize their strategies in this area? Join us to find out. In the Know starts now. Hello and welcome to In the Know, your source for insight and analysis on the issues that matter to our dynamic healthcare market. I'm your host, Gina Clark. Today we take a broad look at the Compendia landscape and how it continues to affect coverage and reimbursement decisions for pharmaceutical products. We'll discuss how public and private payers view Compendia listings in specific therapeutic areas. And we will highlight some best practices for manufacturers looking to integrate their Compendia strategy with their overarching patient access initiatives. Joining us for today's conversation is Jacquelyn Hall, Associate Director at Xcenda. Great to have you here today, Jacquelyn.
Thank you for having me, Gina.
Let's start off with some basics about Compendia. What can you tell us about why Compendia off-label listings are important for pharmaceutical manufacturers, for healthcare providers, and for patients?
Well, the number one reason would be patient access. So drugs and biologics are rapidly advancing, and as a result you see many therapies that have more than one indication that a physician might think is appropriate for a particular patient's condition. So you have these products that have data that's available that shows that it's both safe and efficacious, but there may be either limits or delays in accessing these treatments for various reasons, and one can be the FDA approval process is pretty lengthy. Another reason is that there's some protocols and treatment regimens that are not even reviewed by the FDA. And then lastly, due to some limitations in clinical trials, FDA approvals may not seem very practical. So what you're seeing now is that the Compendia is actually serving as a reference for payers, so they can now look to these to see which products would be used in a more medically appropriate way. And you see the increase in access already in that there's somewhere between 50 to 75% of chemotherapeutic agents are currently being used for off-label listings.
How has the Compendia landscape changed over the last few years, and what impact has this had on public and private payer coverage of off-label drug use?
So the top things that we've seen has been more like a reduction and consolidation in terms of the Compendia that are available for use, and then also an increase in transparency of these Compendia. And both things kind of happened simultaneously. So what we saw was originally there was a lot of Compendia out there. You had AHFS, NCCN, clinical pharmacology, facts and comparison, USPDI, AMADE, drug points, drug decks. And then within a very rather short period of time, you saw a lot of them consolidating, where now you see the primary Compendia available are going to be AHFS, clinical pharmacology, drug decks, and NCCN. Facts and comparisons are still out there, but they're not as readily used by Medicare and Medicaid. And then kind of at the same time that was happening, what CMS did was actually start to redesign how they were looking at their Compendia and which ones they considered to be appropriate for determining medically appropriate indications. And as a result, they came through with a process for which Compendia could actually submit to be included as their approved Compendia. And then along the same time, you saw a lot of attention go into the whole transparency of the Compendia that are out there. So CMS, HHS, AHRQ, and then even some of the like Wall Street journals were doing articles to see how transparent Compendia were going to be, because after all, a lot of the panel members that are making the decisions about which ones are appropriate and not appropriate for off-label indications are the same individuals that may potentially be involved in some of the studies that were going into these decisions.
So how are Compendia currently used by Medicare and Medicaid? And what are the key takeaways for this issue that pharmaceutical manufacturers need to be aware of in this current environment?
So the good news is that when CMS was going through this process, one of the things that happened is that originally Medicare Parts B and D were not using the same approved compendia. But through this process, they have merged, and so now Part B and Part D are both using AHFS, clinical pharmacology, drug dex, and NCCN, with Medicaid just using AHFS and drug dex. So now we see more clear-cut instructions on which compendia CMS is using for Medicare, and then what are the listings that would lead to coverage versus those will not lead to coverage. The key things that manufacturers want to keep in mind is so that although there is clear instructions on which indications and which listings will be covered versus not covered, that doesn't necessarily mean that the compendia themselves are that clear. So for example, with AHFS, they can sometimes be very vague. The way the language is that if it's supportive, then it would be covered by Medicare. If it's not supportive, then it wouldn't. And essentially what you end up having to do is read the listing to figure out whether you think it's supportive or not. And that's, you know, somewhat subjective. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind, is that piece may not be as clear cut. The other thing is that one negative listing will trump all your positive listings. So as you're developing your compendia process, it's important to have a strategy in place to determine which compendia you're actually going to go after. Going after all four compendia may not be the best move because, after all, one negative listing in, say, AHFS will trump a positive listing in clinical pharmacology, drug dex, and NCCN. Lastly, as I mentioned, there's this new process in place to either be added or removed from the Medicare-approved compendia list. So it's important for manufacturers to continue to monitor what's happening with CMS to see if they've made any updates to their approved lists.
In what ways do these issues impact cancer care, a therapeutic area undergoing substantial scrutiny for how, when, and why certain drugs are being used?
It's a good question. So this actually, cancer and compendia go back, even back to like the 1990s. And so what you saw back then was that there was this movement towards what we called cancer coverage acts. And so these are the acts where it was initiated by ACCC and a lot of the state cancer societies, which are basically to come up with legislation that will require commercial payers to honor the compendia listings for a lot of off-label cancer indications. One of the problems, though, is, as I mentioned, a lot of these laws were enacted in the 1990s. So all the consolidation of the compendia that happened has changed which compendia are available, and some of these laws are referencing these compendia that are no longer in print or no longer updated. So one of the things that manufacturers really need to focus on is making sure that they're working with commercial payers to ensure that, you know, in the event that one of the laws are out of date, that they're working with them to ensure that their patients have not only access to these products, but they can do that in an affordable way.
As part of Xcenda's work for pharmaceutical manufacturers, the company surveys dozens of payer and provider organizations. What insights can you share about how private payers plan to use compendia for coverage decisions? For example, are there particular disease types or drug types where the compendia use is more prevalent?
Glad you asked that question. We've recently done a survey that was very interesting. We did it with the Managed Care Network, which has payers that cost the entire board in terms of payer type. And we have 50 different respondents to the survey. And we asked them questions about how they're using compendia to make off-label coverage decisions. And partly, which may not be a surprise, the top compendia that they're using to make off-label coverage decisions for oncology products is NCCN. But also important to note that other compendia that they were mentioning that they use were facts and comparison, drug points, and again, like I mentioned, these are compendia that are not approved by CMS. Other things they mentioned were actually using treatment guidelines like P4, and then also local oncologists to make these decisions. Although they did reference that they were using compendia for all cancer types, the ones that were mentioned the most were going to be breast cancer, lung cancer, and colon cancer. And so we did ask them about non-oncology as well. And interestingly enough, 50% of the individuals that we surveyed are using compendia for non-oncology indications as well. The top compendia that they're using is drug dex, and what we found is what they're using the compendia to make the decisions for are IVIG, and rheumatoid arthritis, and then biologics.
What could you tell us about how therapies are reviewed and selected for inclusion in the most frequently referenced compendia?
So when I think about the most frequently referenced compendia, I think about AHFS, clinical pharmacology, drug dex, and NCCN. Unfortunately, AHFS, clinical pharmacology, don't actually have a standard review process, submission process, or a timeline. And although drug decks and NCCN do have instructions on how you can submit to them for inclusion, they also do not have a formal timeline. So you could submit, and it could be within months or it could be within years before you're reviewed. It kind of depends on their priority. But one thing that they are getting, again, like I mentioned, more transparent. For example, NCCN does have on their website, you can actually see the panel members that are involved in making the decisions for the different therapeutic areas that they review.
Armed with all this knowledge, what can pharmaceutical companies do to ensure their products are positioned appropriately within the most commonly referenced compendia?
There's actually a lot they can do. The first step, though, that I would recommend is that when you're coming up with a strategy, it does need to be disease state or product specific. So one of the things that you'll notice when you actually look at the listings is that the robustness of the data and the type of endpoints that they're looking at for one indication is vastly different from a different indication. So each strategy is going to be indication specific. The other thing that you're going to want to do is actually start benchmarking what it takes to get a positive versus a negative listing. And so you're going to look at your competitors or the area or in your disease state, looking at their listings to see what evidence was needed to get a positive versus a negative listing. And you want to set that as your benchmark. The other thing you want to do is then do a gap analysis to see where your product is in relation to those benchmarks that were set. If you're being savvy and you're doing this before your product is coming to market and this is in, phase 2 or phase 3, this will be great because you can actually use that information to help design the next clinical trials that you're going to put in place. If you're doing it while you're in the midst of the clinical trials, you can use this information to make sure that you're on task and are you, meeting these minimum benchmarks. If you've already done your clinical trials, then you can actually look at your benchmark, see have you met those marks, are there any additional studies that you need to do to make your evidence stronger to get that positive listing. The other thing you need to do is pretty much keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening. A lot of the payers are responding to who the industry leaders are, so who they are today may not be the same as tomorrow. It's important to do a lot of market research to see, how payers are using the compendia to make coverage decisions, what key opinion leaders think about it, and how potentially compendia are influencing treatment guidelines and vice versa. So that's the kind of information you're going to want to get as you're starting to do this strategy and continuing to develop those in the future.
So Jacquelyn, as a rule, how much focus are pharmaceutical companies giving to this issue?
That varies a lot from company to company. So, it really depends on pretty much how proactive your company is going to be. As I mentioned, there are, some companies that will start looking at their compendia strategy when they're in phase 2 or phase 3. That's really the opportune time that you want to do that. Because, for example, with clinical pharmacology, you can actually submit to clinical pharmacology before your FDA approval. And what that allows you to do is that while you are preparing for your FDA launch, you can submit to that, and best case scenario, at launch, you have maximized patient access to all these different indications, the FDA approved indication and potentially any of the off-label indications that patients may need access to as well. And so those are going to be your savvy companies. But another thing that can happen is it just really can happen organically as well. So you may have a product, they may start to realize that there's another indication for it, and these things can happen, post-product launch and even as the product is more developed.
What roles within the pharma companies are drawing attention to this area of need or opportunity?
Primarily, it's going to come out of your medical affairs department, led by your medical liaisons. But then there's going to be a whole slew of individuals within the company that are also going to assist. And that could be, from your brand team, from your managed care team. It really depends on the organization.
So do recent or anticipated changes in health policy impact how Medicare and Medicaid will approach this issue? And if so, how?
Yeah, we get that question a lot, and it's interesting. So in terms of a direct impact, no. Healthcare reform does not directly impact how Medicare and Medicaid are going to be using compendia. That's governed independently by CMS. What it may impact, though, is your patient payer populations. So as a result of healthcare reform, we may see increases in different payer populations that are not governed by CMS. And so these could be, for example, your commercial payer populations. And so one of the things that manufacturers are going to want to keep an eye, kind of their finger on the pulse on again, is to see how these payer populations are handling using compendia for coverage decisions.
In what ways might a pharmaceutical company integrate its compendia strategy with its overall patient access strategy? And what types of internal or external resources should be dedicated toward these efforts compared to other payer relations initiatives?
Good question. So one of the things they can do is, as they're creating their patient access strategy, the Compendia strategy actually can fit in very well with that. And one of the examples is that a lot of manufacturers have a reimbursement hotline that's available to ensure and help both physicians and patients access therapies in a more affordable way. One of our sister companies actually does a phenomenal job in creating these patient hotlines, the Lash Group. And another service that they can do is assist physicians when they are interested in off-label indication. So obviously manufacturers cannot be in the field promoting off-label indications. But in the event that a physician, say they're savvy and they're keeping track of what the best therapies that are available out there for a particular indication, they're interested in that indication, they can actually call into the hotline, and the hotline can help service them in terms of giving the appropriate resources available to them so that they can access coverage for that particular indication. One of the things they can do internally is make sure they have the appropriate individuals who are out there interfacing with the payers. For example, you may want to have managed care medical liaisons. And so these are individuals that directly work with your payers to help make them understand what additional indications are available and help work through that coverage. And so these particular individuals are a little bit more, are in a better position than, for example, account managers in terms of both understanding the payer's needs, but also being able to explain these off-label indications that potentially are available for coverage.
So Jacquelyn, how do you foresee Compendia strategies evolving over time? What will drive changes in how pharmaceutical companies approach this area of opportunity?
Hopefully we see that their strategies and these tactical plans are being integrated further and further into the clinical trial phase, so before the product goes into launch. Because again, the idea is that the most savvy manufacturers who are going to have the most amount of patient access are going to be those that incorporate earlier on. One thing that we think that's also going to help drive this is with the healthcare reform, in the sense that another movement is with comparative effectiveness. And so the idea is that healthcare reform, comparative effectiveness, this is all done so that we can help hopefully drive down the cost of healthcare. One of the ways in potentially doing that is starting to look at some products for off-label indications that may be less expensive than those who are on-label. So for example, if we had a product that was, say, $50 versus one, and this is the off-label one, versus an on-label product that's $2,000, you may start to see payers looking at including the off-label indication product in their coverage decision, including the ones that are on-label.
Jacquelyn, thank you for providing some clarity on such a crucial issue with manufacturers.
Thank you for having me, Gina.
And thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with another all-new episode. Until then, if it's on your mind, it's In the Know.